All right, let's have a look at a more complex example using a production rig. So in this case, we have this firewolf, and I've hidden the mesh, but you can see here, if I hide the rigids, how he's entirely driven by these rigid bodies. And if we were to apply a mimic to the root of this guy, then just like a normal sort of smaller chain, we would get this, this entire hierarchy of controls, and he would now be influenced by this hierarchy. But if we disable this guy, we could also apply mimics to isolated regions of the characters. In this case, let's make one for the for one of the front legs, and because what will happen is it will walk the hierarchy from wherever you start. So if you make one from the back leg, then the same thing will happen. And in this case, he will try and match the local pose of this leg, and obviously ignore the root, unless you have the soft pin, enabled. So let's say, for example, that you were to give him some soft pin. So now the front leg would be driven towards this controller over here, and then the back leg would try and match this pose, back here. And you can see you can get quite complex using this approach. And you can obviously have more than one. So now you have, partial mimics, multiple partial mimics, and you can sort of enable and disable these as you go. And the final thing that's interesting to note, I think, is that the ridges were created on these animation controls, and you can see the hierarchies. It's not straightforward. It's not a linear hierarchy. It's quite complicated, and some of these things aren't actually part of the same hierarchy. They're actually constrained because there's space switching. So this tail, for example, even though it looks like it's part of this hierarchy, you can tell from, it's a bit messy. Let's see if we can hide most of the things. You can tell from the selection highlighting that these aren't actually, the tail isn't actually part of this hierarchy. It's not being selected, and that's because it's constrained to this hierarchy. But the mimic hierarchy that you get, that on the other hand will be a clean hierarchy. So if we look at this one, you can see this is a sort of a straightforward linear hierarchy. There's nothing hidden. Everything is parented in the order that it appears to be parented. In this case, you can see the tail is actually an actual parent of the root. And so you can think of this blue hierarchy as a control rig. It's essentially rigged for you, and it will be set up in the same sort of layout as your original chain. So if you were to, because in this case you made the chain by selecting, this hip, and then you skipped a control. I'm saying you. When I did this hierarchy, I selected the root and I skipped one of the controls, and then made the next rigid over here, which is why there's not a rigid for this control specifically. And so the hierarchy itself is complicated, and the hierarchy that you created, or I created with these rigids, it's even more complicated, because you have all these things that are parent constrained and not regularly parented, and then also skipping a few controls here and there, like for the neck as well. It's missing a lot of the original animation controls. But that doesn't matter, because all of what Ragdoll knows is these rigids. And these rigids, under the hood, they're all in world space. And so it's just taking this world space hierarchy of rigid bodies and translating it into a simple local space just for your convenience. And that will work with any amount of complexity, including scaled controls, like negatively scaled for mirroring, or pivots of all sorts, of all manners and kinds.